Thank you. And you, kind sir, what's your first name, sir?
Collins, fine.
Collins. I'm Rick. How you doing?
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, yeah. Now, what I want to do, I hope, is kind of give you guys a nice tour of mainly one decade, 1857, 1867. And all I'm really trying to do is just to show you in very practical and real ways how profoundly the Civil War changed money, period. Coins, currency, banking, the works. Some of the changes were intended only to be wartime measures, but as with the national banking system, it became permanent. And some things like "In God We Trust," which were introduced during the Civil War, ultimately that became the nation's motto 100 years later. But you just don't realize all the many permutations in life. So we wanted just to show you the best we could what life was like just before the war. So let's see what we can show here. Oh yeah, that's right. The most important thing to tell you is that a penny then is worth a quarter now. So when you say, well, these guys had 2-cent pieces and 3-cent pieces, it's, you know, that was 50 cents, 75 cents, a buck. It had some buying power. And I'll tell you that the South reneged on $200 million worth of debts to the North when they struck out on their own. But 200 million times 25 is a real chunk of change. It's a lot of money. So I just want to put that in perspective. It's really, really important. And of course you can see a quart of milk cost 4 cents and a pound of roasted coffee, when you could still buy it, of course that disappeared during the war, was 23 cents. And of course, in the South, as inflation got worse and worse and worse, I mean, you know, the numbers were astronomical. Now, it's Ron, right? Is that,
Yes.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Ron and I were talking about up until 1857, and probably well beyond, you could spend anything that came your way. There were Spanish coins, French coins, Peruvian coins, and you as you know, let's take Kendra downstairs, would have to open her cash register and figure out, what the hell am I supposed to do? You know, what is this worth? And everyone was issued a little piece of paper that basically, you know, helped you do the math. But boy, I mean, it must have been a nightmare to try to do any transaction for just the ordinary merchant. I mean, if you were wealthy and you could spend gold and silver left and right, but it was the copper penny and the copper half penny and all that jazz, which a lot of people relied on, which disappeared during the war. Now, in terms of the United States Mint, that's a different story. We'll get into that now. The mint itself, we'll get into more detail. When the war broke out, there were 5 mints in operation. It was in Philadelphia, which is where the first one was, San Francisco, which of course got started during the gold rush, Dahlonega, Georgia, during the Georgia gold rush, as well as Charlotte, North Carolina, and the behemoth was New Orleans. And New Orleans was every bit as powerful as New York as a mercantile center in the 1830s. Andrew Jackson didn't trust New York bankers. He insisted on building a mint in New Orleans to keep it as far away from New York as he possibly could. That's the gospel truth. And when the war broke out, the South took 3 of the 5 mints that were in operation, which decimated the amount of currency that the Philadelphia and remaining San Francisco mint could produce. Anyway,
Is there a Carson City Mint?
There is. That's a fascinating place after the Silver Rush, but that came 20 years maybe after the Civil War. And Denver also, which became very powerful, but during the Civil War it didn't exist. So
Yes.
I don't even know. Colorado wasn't even a state then, was it?
Nevada. No, it wasn't.
Okay.
It was Nevada.
Now this is a little smorgasbord of images, and I'll explain them. Some of these coins circulated during the Civil War too, I mean minted during the Civil War and after. But there was a half cent, a full large cent, which is about the size of a quarter. And we have one with us if you want to just hold one and say, oh, that's what it was like. There's a 2-cent piece, but that didn't come out until 1864 during the war. A little itty bitty 3-cent piece, the tiniest coin we ever minted out of Philadelphia, is called a fish scale, because it's so tiny. I know people that go metal detecting and they find them by the boatloads in places because you drop them all the time. It was easy.
Which one is that up there, the one to the far left?
Yeah, let me see this.
Middle
I
left?
wonder if this thing will work on the
Sure.
plan. You press this to middle,
Yeah.
your center.
Here it is.
Yeah, it works, but when you hit the screen, nothing happens. We're dry. Well, anyway, the one that has the Roman numeral 3 is the 3-cent piece. And then there's a half dime and a nickel, which was introduced in 1866. And for a while, we had both a half dime and a nickel, which is kind of weird. So half dozen one, six of the other. I have no idea what was going on. People thought of that. And then, of course, there was the standard seeded Liberty, dime, and quarter, and half dollar. In New Orleans, they were producing a prodigious amount of those half dollars, 2.5 million of them in 1861. This is one of the biggest changes that took place. I don't know if you guys collect coins or not, but the large cent was outlawed at the same time the foreign money was outlawed in 1857. It was a big, heavy coin. They trimmed it down. The Flying Eagle cent was made to be the same size as the penny we know today. It was made out of copper and nickel. It was fairly heavy. The 1856 variety of that particular coin is worth tens of thousands of dollars. It's very, very rare. And then during the Civil War, we had the standard Indian head penny, which again was largely a nickel composition for a couple of years because the copper was so rare. And then they came with a more full copper version of it after the war. And that's the 3-cent piece in its glory. It was a very pretty little coin, but so tiny. I mean, half the size of a dime, tiny little thing. But it was worth 75 cents worth of buying power today. And then they came out with, yes, a second 3-cent piece right after the war. And both the little one and the bigger one circulated at the same time until about 1873. So once again, the poor merchants, and they're saying, well, we've got a half dime and we have a nickel. Oh, we've got a small 3-cent piece and a large 3-cent, and on and on and on. It must have been really confusing for a while. There's a half dime and a nickel. Hey, pretty coins, but confusing as hell, if you ask me. So then, of course, if you're wealthy, or if you're a banker, you have to carry a lot of gold and silver dollars, of course, all Liberty seeded. And Becky, would you mind just handing me that little poster? I might as well show that off for a minute. We'll get into this later when we get to In God We Trust, but since I'm rather spontaneous with things, there were a lot of people who thought our coinage was too Roman, too pagan, and didn't introduce the word God anywhere. And so I looked into that a little deeper, and indeed it is true that the goddess of liberty is seated and basically resembles in many, many ways Fortuna, which was on many Roman coins at the time. Many of the female deities were seated in the coins from Rome, the Republic of Rome. And Confederate currency, I actually found one note, I'll pass this around, that features a goddess called Bonita, which is no big surprise. She represents money and mints. The South certainly could have used all the money they could get their hands on. They ultimately ran out, but she's seated with money bags all around her, which was the hope and the promise of the Confederate States of America. So yes, there really was a strong influence in our currency from the Roman Empire. So just want to point that out to you, just to kind of illuminate that. Now, Ron, in terms of paper money, man, did we have paper money. We've got some nice examples of it over there on the table. I have the same slide here. Before the war broke out, there were about 8,000 different entities that printed money. That had to be really interesting. Amazing stuff. I mean, from a design perspective, and my grandfather was an engraver for the American Banknote Company, so I can appreciate the work that went into it. But the C&O Canal produced money. The town right here, Shepherdstown, produced its own script for the Confederate widows, as it turned out, before Virginia became West Virginia. For part of it, sorry. And on and on and on. We had a fellow stop by just before the show started who couldn't stay for the show who actually is a die sinker, can make coins himself, but he also said he had the largest collection of script from Shepherdstown than anybody ever had. 31 different notes that the city produced before the war and during the war. But the variety was infinite. And there are many a good reference book about, early American currency. And, we could sit here and talk for maybe 12 hours if we wanted to cover all the notes and type of notes, the banks, the towns, the canals, the railroads. It's just a phenomenal thing to look at. And Ron, if you want to chime in,
No, I'm certainly not an expert. I was just gonna ask, what was behind this? Did a town, did some entity have to authorize someone, or you
Well, the
yourself or business could say, well, we need some more money, so we're gonna print stuff?
There's an apothecary up there, there's a silk manufacturer that, pushed out its own currency. I don't know if there was a
Just based on their
requirement.
own decision, and there wasn't some government who would
yeah.
authorize them to
Well,
do
the little
something?
town of Shepherdstown, if you go down to the Historic Society, which we did to do a little tiny bit of
Mhm.
reconnaissance and talk about our program, the note does say that the town council had to authorize $4,000 worth of script at the time.
So it was paper money.
It was all paper, backed by the town.
Spent only in the town, or could it be spent
That's a
elsewhere?
great question, I don't know. Probably only.
And
in
how
town.
about a merchant doing his own money? Is that spent only in the shop, or is it spent,
Well,
could
yeah,
it be
most of the
spent
money,
everywhere
yes.
else?
That was the whole idea of the company store.
Mhm.
Otherwise, it was illegal, but a lot of these laws, which really transfigured paper money, took place during the Civil War. And that's why everyone was advocating a national banking system, so. Well, the big problem was, you could print $1 and say it's worth $1, and Ron could print $1 and say it's worth $1, but yours is only worth 5 cents because you have nothing to back it up.